Hi all, I'm Waldemar, chess trainer and teacher. Today I want to discuss the thrilling encounter between Levon Aronian and Magnus Carlsen that was played during the fourth round of this year's Norway Chess tournament in Stavanger, Norway. The game was incredibly complex and I'm still struggling to understand it completely. However, in this video I will try and find a shimmer of the objective truth underlying this game. At the same time, I also want to take a look at the psychological side of things, because from that perspective the game was not unfair, but certainly uneven, to say the least. And it is to Aronian's credit that he knew how to exploit this aspect of the struggle fully. I've also tried to find all the critical positions where sides could have played better, and in fact I think it makes sense to first look at the game from that point of view. I will briefly indicate these moments and then return to discussing the game move by move. Now, my original notes to this game were in Dutch, but then I decided to do the video in English for this international channel, my Better Your Chess channel. So I will also be doing some instantaneous translation as I go along, so please bear with me. So let's first look at the critical moments of this game. There is a function in ChessBase which allows you to make special annotations, and one of these special annotations is critical middle game position, and then if you add an annotation to a move it will turn red in the notation. So let me just scroll to these position. The first critical position arose after White's 11th move, a3. Now this was critical, of course, because this sacrifices the pawn. And here Carlsen had to decide, shall I take the pawn and maybe play right into Aronian's idea, which he was maybe not even completely fully aware of, right, this idea. So that was important. Now next go to the position after White's 13th move, which was c4, c5, completely locking up Black's queen. Here, since Black's queen is threatened, again, Carlsen had to decide, how am I going to defend myself against the threat of my queen being chased around and caught in the corner of the board there on the queen side. So that was also a very important point, and he had a number of moves at his disposal. So that was the second moment. Now let's go to the third moment, which arises after White's 14th move, b3, b4. This was an important moment, and I suppose that Aronian also could have played something else there, something more direct. But again, he sort of put the onus on Magnus, saying to Magnus, well, I'm just keeping your queen locked up. What are you going to do? Then the next moment was after White's 16th move, bishop takes e4. Now that bishop is looking ominously towards the h7 square, but also to the c6 and the a8 squares. All three squares containing black pieces. So how to react here? Maybe there was an opportunity for Carlsen to play a bit more precise and to keep White's initiative, and with it also, I suppose, his objective advantage at bay. Okay, so we go on to, I think, already the fifth important moment, which arises after White's 18th move, knight g5 check. Here there was the choice for Black to either go king g8, as he played in the game, or go king g6, which might have been much tougher and more testing. Okay, then we go on to the position after White's 26th move, e3, e4, attacking Black's knight in the center. I think that Carlsen made a mistake here. He didn't play the most incisive defense. Okay, as mentioned, we will take a more in-depth look later on when we discuss the game move by move. And then we go on to, I didn't really keep count, I think this is moment number 8. Now this moment arises after Black's move, queen g5. And I think that maybe Aronian slipped up a little bit here. Instead of having a significant advantage, he might have just ended up with only a small advantage that could have been defendable or defensible. English remains a difficult language. Okay, and then we go on. Is there another moment? Yes, here. I think this is moment number 9. Okay, this moment, or this critical middle game position, arises after White's 31st move, Rook d1. And I think that it is only here that Carlsen really made the decisive mistake, right? Yeah. Well, okay. So I've showed you all the critical positions. Now let's go back to the beginning, yeah? The beginning of the game. Let me scroll up again. And let's start our discussion of the game after Black's move, Black's 9th move, Queen d8 to e7. So he's lining up the queen with the bishop, right? So probably Carlsen must have thought, well, in that case, I will at least not be disturbed by a3 kicking my bishop on b4 when I would have to retreat my bishop or exchange my bishop for the knight on c3, leaving my opponent with the bishop pair. Okay, well, now here comes a very interesting moment. In the game, on the 10th move, Aronian plays here bishop c2. Now this move sets a trap, and to me is also the best move, or at least the most interesting move of the game. This move looks completely innocuous, and it's also completely invisible, I think, what the idea is of the move. But what has changed is that the pawn on b3 now has some extra protection, and also that the second row is, let's say, more shielded from the side. It also, on top of that, gives Black the opportunity to make a, let's say, ineffective move under certain circumstances. Normally you don't just want to hand your opponent an extra move, an extra tempo, because normally, and especially the world champion, will do something very useful for this move. Okay, now how all of this will be more relevant, it's very difficult to imagine, but I will try to explain that along the way. So Carlsen must have thought, bishop c2, what is all that about? Okay, well, one of the ideas is maybe on the surface is that if Black ever were to play e5, e4, then at least he would not be threatening a fork on both white minor pieces, because the bishop has already stepped out of the way, right? But I think that's just something on the surface. During the post-mortem, Aronian was joking against Short that he sort of improvised with this idea that he's about to play of a3, allowing Black to take on a3 and then sacrificing the exchange on a3, saying that, oh well, maybe this whole idea with sacrificing the exchange and then c4, c5 was not so bad after all, right? But I bet you that he had this position on his computer or on his board in his study at home. And I also don't rule out the opportunity that he knew exactly what was going on and why bishop c2 is so innocuous but at the same time so venomous. Okay, well, back to Carlsen. It's his move. I think there was a number of possibilities. Very interesting idea was, for instance, here to just simply break out with the move e5, you know, in the future giving his bishop some air to breathe. But maybe he was afraid that he would run into some preparation. And indeed, there is a very funny move here. It is a piece sacrifice. Knight takes d5. Looks completely ridiculous, but Black can take that piece. But then it turns out that after the exchange on b4, whites start taking quite a lot of black pawns. This is the second pawn already. For instance, if you jump forward with that knight, knight e4, then there is already a third pawn. And I can imagine that as a black player you don't want to play this, especially when your opponent has prepared this. This is already 3 pawns and 2 beautiful central pawns on the 5th rank for the piece. So that looks like very, very interesting compensation. There is a way to sort of back down from this by sacrificing the piece back by playing d takes c4, but then after e takes f6, knight f6, queen d4, bishop e6, knight g5, white also seems to develop some sort of initiative. For instance, rook ac8, queen h4, hammering down on the h7 square, and after h6, white at least gains the slight advantage of bishop versus knight, and he has also managed to quite seriously weaken a lot of black's light squares. Now, of course, there is maybe still a bit of a problem along the c file, and white's queen on h4 is also unprotected, as is the bishop on c2. So this is certainly not the end of the story. I'm not claiming that white is winning here, but just for starters, to completely visualize this variation and know that your opponent has probably prepared this is more than enough reasons for these world top guys not to go down these paths. So instead, Carlsen chose a much more modest, but at the same time also understandable move. He played here rook d8, and he is bringing the rook in a vis-a-vis toward white's queen, and with all the possible breaks in the center, it's quite possible that some central files will open, and then of course it makes sense for the rook to be opposite the white queen. But here I would like to go back to what I said earlier. It also gives this bishop c2 move black the possibility to make a less incisive move under certain conditions. And one of the drawbacks of rook d8 is that it leaves the f7 pawn more exposed. And this becomes very relevant later on in the game. We will see that Aronian makes use of that factor. So here comes a3, attacking the bishop, and well, Nigel Short was completely surprised, taken aback by this move, and it took him a while to realize what was maybe the idea of white here. And there was also a very small video fragment circling the internet where somebody is coming up to the board and Aronian has left the board, and Carlsen is studying the position, and Carlsen makes a move, a gesture like, you know, towards the person standing next to the board, indicating as if he were to say, I don't know what's going on here, should I take the pawn or not? What is this? What is white's plan? Right? Now, the safe thing to do, of course, would be here to retreat the bishop, right? And then I think you don't really have to be too afraid of this space and time gaining move c5, because you just simply retreat the bishop, and then on the next move you will try and break out with e5, and there is quite a lot of a potential energy pointing towards white's king side. You know, also the knight can jump and the queen is maybe ready to go there. Maybe the rook in that case would not be posted most effectively, but it can also be brought back to the e file. In the meantime, of course, white can also try and expand here on the queen side. But I think that black would have quite decent chances by playing this push in the center e5. And let's not forget that white's bishop on d2 is not the best bishop in the world, right? So this, I think, would have been a very modest way and correct way to play for black. But keep this in mind. This may also have made Carlsen's task more difficult. So far he played 3 draws. He's in his own country, he's on the home turf, everybody expects him to win. He would like to have another good result, because the last tournament that he won outright, I think it was already Bilbao 2016, I'm not completely sure there, probably some of you will be able to correct me. But I think he is eagerly looking or awaiting another good result with which he can stamp his dominance on the world of chess once again. So this also may have led him to believe, I really have to play the fighting move, go into the complications here. And I think that's why he played bishop a3. Maybe here he was still not completely sure what was going on. Maybe he thought the idea can never be, of course, that white is going to sacrifice the exchange here like a madman. But maybe white's idea was just simply to lure the bishop to a3, from where it is no longer influencing the knight on c3, which in turn is influencing the center. So maybe he thought, by luring my bishop away from a function that involves the central squares, white's idea could be here to play e4, and then play de4, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4. But here, I suppose, being a pawn up, Carlsen could simply offer the exchange of more pieces. And I think that also he is quite safe here. Now, white does not need to exchange the bishops here, but other than that, it's also not very easy to see where his play would come from. Maybe he could go bishop g5, but then probably f6, and I think, well, white has, I think, enough compensation for the sacrificed pawn, and maybe Carlsen thought, well, this is what white has prepared, this is his idea. And in as far as everybody was still not clear as to the idea of Aronian, after bishop takes a3, he indeed sacrificed here. Rook takes a3. Okay, well, of course now queen takes a3 is forced. But in sacrificing the exchange, he has lured the black queen to the queen side, and now he completely shuts off any escape routes back to the center of the king side for that black queen with c4, c5. And of course this is the idea of the exchange sacrifice. Now the queen is in danger of getting trapped, which would simply lead to an immediate loss of the game. Well, when he played bishop a3, I'm pretty sure that, of course, in the end, Carlsen realized, what happens if he really go bonkers, sacrifices the exchange, which means that he will lure my queen out in the open, shut it off with c4, c5. Will my queen be lost? I think that Carlsen saw that there are several opportunities to now try and safeguard the queen, because otherwise he would never have taken on a3 in the first place, of course. But I suppose that it makes sense now to first look at what white is threatening after c4, c5. And the threat we can investigate if we, let's say, skip black's move. And the threat here is to start, if he would have an extra tempo as mentioned, if he would start with knight b1. Now here there are several answers. There's queen a1, queen a2, queen b2, right? All of them save the queen. Now let's look at all three of them. Let's start with queen a1. Now, if you attack the queen again with bishop c3, there still is the a2 escape square. So what is it that white would like to do right now, which is not possible yet? It is, of course, to play bishop c3 under circumstances where he also controls the a2 square, because in that case the queen would be trapped. Now, how to make that possible? Well, there is the very interesting bishop h7 check. If we take that with the king, then immediately we play king c2 check. We not only attack the king, but we also defend the aforementioned a2 square. And after king g2, bishop c3, it has become clear that black's queen is just simply trapped, right? So maybe after bishop takes h7, knight h7 changes matters, because then queen c2 is not with a check. But then again, you play queen c2, and I don't see how black can save his queen here, because bishop c3 remains the threat. Maybe you can just simply break out with knight c5, try and make the best of it. But then again, bishop c3 comes. Okay, let's make a desperado. Queen takes c3, knight c3, knight d7. And now, after knight a4, it turns out that white, who has the queen against bishop, pawn and rook, comes out on top with quite a significant edge. I think that he has very good chances of winning this game. Okay, so that's as far as the threat of knight b1 is concerned and the defense queen a1. How if white were to execute the threat with knight b1 and black would go to queen a2? The same question as applies, I suppose. What would white like to do now? If white were to attack the queen now with knight c3, then it would not really be possible for the queen to go to a5, because then there would be a discovered check with knight c3 takes d5, completely ruining the black's position. But there still would be the escape square on a3 for black to go to. So first, white takes away that square, right? So he now takes away that escape square from the queen. Black can defend now against the threatened knight a3 with a5. Sort of, let's say, resigning himself to the idea that the queen will be caught. Then knight c3 follows, knight b2, knight a4, queen a2, and bishop b1, and it's gotcha. We have the queen. So in this case, white would also be winning. Now there is another defense after bishop b4, that would be knight e4, which defends, of course, against the knight coming to c3, threatening the queen. So in this case, white could eliminate that defender by playing bishop takes e4, d takes e4, knight c3, queen b2, and again knight a4, queen a2, and let me see, what did I thought of knight d2, just bringing in another hunter, and a5 again falls short, because now we have knight c3, and after queen b2 there is another piece to attack and trap black's queen, which is knight c4. So also that defense would not work. Then let's go to the final defense in the position where white were allowed to execute the threat with knight b1. And that would be not queen a1 or queen a2, but queen b2. Well, then there would be bishop c3, and we get sort of the same position after queen a2, because then white again will play bishop b4 and so on, leading to the same variation as after queen a2. Okay, so this is the threat that Carlsen is facing at the moment after c4, c5, the threat of knight b1 and sort of immediately winning, right? So how on earth can you defend against something like that? Now, just try and imagine yourself in Carlsen's position. What does black have to do? This threat is hanging above his head like a sword of Damocles. Now, if we try and describe purely in words, so not in moves or mathematical chess possibilities, what black can do is he can try and tear down the fence that is keeping his queen in the cage. And when I'm talking about the fence, I'm of course talking about this fence, right? So you can try and break down that fence. What you also can try and do is find some sort of hole through the fence to safely escape back home. Now, one of these holes might be, for instance, this, right? You just simply retreat the queen. And then another opportunity would be to try and exchange, eliminate the animals that are going to be hunting the queen. So, because if you exchange, let's say, the knights and the bishops, especially, you know, this one and this one and this one, they're all chasing the queen. If you just exchange them, then maybe they will no longer be able to catch the queen, right? And then, of course, there is the possibility of somehow trying to combine all those ideas. Now, let's try and look at black's possibilities from that point of view. So what are the options here after c4, c5 for black? I think there is, for starters, the move e6, e5. This one, which tries to, e5, which tries to somehow break down the barrier. There is maybe also the move knight e4, which tries to eliminate one of the hunters, right? And then there is also the move which was played in the game b6, which is trying to break down the fence from the other side. And it becomes clear that if white were ever to take that pawn, then there would be another hole in the fence through which black's queen could escape. Okay, very nice. So I think we have to take a look at all those possibilities and try and figure out if one is better than the other or not. Okay, so let's just start with e5, right? Well, I think the most logical thing to figure out is what happens if white now simply executes his threat, which started always with knight b1. Queen a2 could be played, bishop b4, and now e takes d4, which for a moment keeps white's knight out of c3, but white reinstates that threat with e takes d4. And one defense now is to play knight e4 to bring in another defender to try and keep white's knight away from c3. But here it is it's again probably just not enough for black. Now there is the idea here with bishop takes c4, where we can just simply try and threaten knight c3 again. But after d takes c4, knight c3, queen b2, knight a4, queen a2, it becomes apparent that white's last move of his idea of catching the queen, which was always bishop b1, is no longer at his disposal. Therefore, it makes more sense after knight e4 not to play bishop e4, but play the more patient, very interesting, more patient knight c3. Excuse me, after knight e4 here, knight c3, which does attack the queen. Now, black can take that knight, which was the idea all along, but now after bishop c3, it becomes apparent that again black has not solved the problem of his queen, and that now he also has the problem of his king, and he simply doesn't have time and opportunity to solve all his problems. One idea would be to go knight f6, but then after queen d3 it becomes apparent that there is nothing to be done about the move rook a1, simply catching the queen here. So that, I think, ends the discussion of e6, e5, apart from one very major difference. And now I'm probably going to try and indicate why the move bishop d3 c2 was so important on the 10th move. Let's go back once more to the defense after c5 with e5, because after bishop b1, king, queen a2, bishop b4, e takes d4, e takes d4, black does not have to play knight e4 here, threatening or defending against knight c3, but also he can go here queen b2, already sidestepping the attack on his queen by means of knight c3. So some sort of prophylactical move. If white now plays knight c3 anyway, with the idea of following it up with knight a4, again chasing and winning the queen, then now we see a very big difference between the position with bishop c2 and without bishop c2 on the 10th move. Black could, for instance, try and defend against knight a4 here with b5. Now if white takes that en passant, then black will recapture with the knight on b6, still defending against knight a4. But here comes a very important move, queen e2, and I think this is the big difference. Here the queen now cannot be exchanged, right? Because the bishop is in the way. There is no exchange possible. Also, black cannot take on b3 because the bishop, which is moved on the 10th to c2, is protecting the b3 pawn. And last but not least, after queen e2, there is the very strong threat of bishop h7 check, winning the queen. So in playing like this, white wins a very important tempo, and now a move like knight e4 is just simply too late because of rook b1. Now all this, starting with queen e2, would not have been possible if white had not moved his bishop to c2 on the 10th move. I hope that makes sense to you and that I've somehow tried to figure that one out. So this is probably a very important and decisive line in the whole complex of trying to chase down and win black's queen, which starts with the exchange sacrifice on a3. Okay, well, I think we've said enough now, really, about the defense with e5. Let's try and take a look at another defensive try, which was knight e4. And I think, with hindsight, that this was probably the best defense Carlsen could have played. As mentioned, he played b6 in the game, but I think this would have given him the best chances. Now, this move is quicker and more direct than e6, e5. Black immediately tries to eliminate one of white's hunters by means of exchanging it. Well, let's see what could come of this, because there is a number of very interesting ideas here. For instance, white could make a mistake now with bishop b1. Now the execution of the threat is not as strong as it would have been without knight e4. Queen, oh excuse me, I'm pushing the wrong button here, knight b1. Queen a2, bishop b4 was always the idea. a5, knight c3 was always the idea, but this knight can be taken, which has to be recaptured. And now, after a4, black crawls out of the hole, right? So here, the whole defense with knight e4 really made sense, because the knight could simply eliminate white's knight as soon as it arrived on c3. The game could continue with queen d3, threatening something on h7, defending, but now a very final important thing to note: rook a1 is not really a problem for black, because he sacrifices his queen, and after the recapture he has the discovered attack, the double attack on both white's bishops. And in this position, I would even dare to say that black has a small advantage. He will regain one of the bishops, so materially he will no longer be in any problem. And he has an extra pawn, he has an open file for his rook. I think that black would be better here. So after knight e4, the execution of the threat with knight b1 would not be the way to go. There would also be the opportunity to first play then knight takes e4 instead. But then of course this knight also is exchanged and can no longer attack the queen with knight b1. D takes e4 would be played, and then after b takes e4, bishop takes e4, it also becomes apparent that after a5 there are not enough hunters to really trap black's queen, and on the next move black is going to play a4, breaking out. Now note that this is a very important move, this a6, a5, because in the game Aronian plays b3, b4, which would stop this breakout move a6, a5, so that's important to remember. Okay, well then, what is white's best try after the defense with 13, knight e4? White's best try is to eliminate that knight with the bishop. And after d takes e4, make some sort of a switch to the king side with knight g5. And now we see that both h7 and f7 are vulnerable, not in the least because black has moved away his rook from the defense of the f7 square. Well, the game could continue with knight f6, simply defending, of course, against the threatening queen sortie by putting the black knight on a very natural square. But now, here comes another hunter, queen c2, again threatening knight b1 with catching the black queen. Knight d5 is still a defensive try, but that knight can be taken. And now, after e takes d5, bishop c3, black is going to lose the queen due to yet another new hunter arriving on the scene, rook f1 to a1. So it looks as though black might as well resign here, but there is one final fantastic resource in the position, and that has to do with white's weaknesses in turn. Now, can you spot the white weakness here? Maybe you've seen it. It is the knight on g5. Where can it go to? It has only one save square left, right? All the other squares, such as f3, e4, e6, f7, h7, they're all not accessible. There is only one safe square where the knight could go to if the knight gets attacked, right? And that may bring black to see the next idea. Rook d6. This is absolutely brilliant. Now, of course, the idea is still, if that rook gets taken, then the fence is teared down and black's queen can escape from the queen side. And now after knight h3, which is probably the best move, and the subsequent variation, we see that white may be up a piece, but in return for that, black already has 3 pawns White's king is not feeling very happy, and also White's bishop is not the best. Of course, he can try and activate it with bishop a5, try and bring it to c7, from where it would fulfill some very useful defensive purposes. But I think that in this position, black holds the balance with queen f3 check, forcing rook g2, and now h5, very nasty, threatening to just simply attack that pinned rook. And if ever White's bishop were to appear on g3, well, it would already be kicked away, or maybe the bishop would not even arrive on c7 because we would play h4 immediately. So this is extremely interesting, right? So White's best try would be bishop e4, but even then, as mentioned in the line up until here, bishop c3, black has this fantastic resource with rook d6. So then you might say, okay, but then why would I free the black queen by taking the rook on d6 if that is just good enough for black to hold the balance? Why not be more patient with a move like f4? Indeed, that would be better. But then here comes rook g6, extremely interesting. And now king h1, stepping out of the pin which is about to arise on the g file. And now after f6 and this sequence of moves, indeed White might claim that he has an edge here. This position is probably better for White than the other one where black's queen remains on the board. So I think in hindsight that after c4, c5 here, black's best defensive try would have been to play knight e4, and then White's best try would have been to play bishop takes e4, and then we would go along this very long sort of forcing line, and we would end up in this, let's call it end game, where black has a number of pawns for the bishop. In fact, he has two, but of course White has the better chances because he has the extra piece. So yeah, very interesting, all of this. So now that we have mentioned what I think to be black's defense after c5, we have to turn back to what Carlsen played in the game. And let me just quickly see how long we've been recording already. Okay, I cannot really see that from here, but I think that it's already a very long recording. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to, let's say, stop the recording here, call this recording thus far part 1, and then in part 2 we will do the remainder of the game. So thanks for your attention. I realize that you've been sitting here and listening to me for already a long time. I should give you a break, myself as well. Please remember, if you like this video, subscribe to my channel or give a thumbs up. I'm a chess trainer and teacher, so please take a look on betteryourchess.com, become a member of our university. You can also visit my Dutch website, which is waldemarmoes.nl. Try and contact me if you would like to become a better and stronger chess player, because I do give trainings. Okay, well, thanks for your attention, and we'll see you back in part 2. Bye bye.